So basically, I'm going to run through the questions that we were asked to address. And right off the bat, we couldn't agree. So that was kind of fun. Can brain dosimetry, that's an important word, be reliably assessed from past use of cell phones for case control and prospective cohort or epidemiological brain tumor studies? So some of us said yes, and some of us said no under certain circumstances, and so on. So the no argument was that dosimetry is really measurement, and in epidemiology we haven't really had measurement. We talk about exposures, because we don't really have all that much data on previous use. It's recalled, and there's always, in epidemiology, exposure assessment is always a weakness. And so if we're going to have real dosimetry, that's only feasible for prospective collection. And I can read it here. That would be easier. Should it be suggested, it was suggested by our group that one recommendation may be that somehow or other we suggest that these wireless devices have within them the capability to accumulate information about the radiation that they've been putting out over time, and intensity and that kind of thing. And so then for the yes, there was the argument that yes, exposure ascertainment is a big weakness, but nevertheless, since 2001, every single big epidemiological study that's come out has had some positive findings. So even though it's hard, people have been managing to find positive results. And you have to recognize, of course, that if you can see positive results through the fog of this very poor exposure ascertainment, then obviously you've got an underestimation. So again, this collection of data may even extend to the phone use laterality, and that if this was done in all devices moving forward, then eventually we would be in a position where we would be able to download data from case and control phones. And this would also sort of expedite non-cancer epidemiological studies.
I understand that it can also tell whether you're using your phone in speaker mode or holding it next to your head.
Yes. Oh, yes. There's proximity sensors. There's all sorts of things. Yeah, it can say, it would know whether you were texting. After all, I get my phone bill, and it says you were yakking on the phone for this many hours, and you had this many texts with this many characters, blah, blah, blah. So there's a huge amount of data that could be collected and compiled to, there's still going to be uncertainties. Maybe, mother lent the phone to the child, and they played games for ages or something. But in epidemiology, you're never going to have absolutely perfect exposure assessment. And this is actually quite difficult. This radio frequency is more difficult than, chemicals. Because even though chemicals are ephemeral in the body to a certain extent, there's still some traces of dioxins or something. There's some hint there years later, whereas with RF exposure, it's here today and gone today. So yes, there are weaknesses even in dosimetry, that's the measurement. There are large uncertainties in near-field exposure estimation, which is estimation of the exposure close up. And of course, that's the exposure that we're estimating when we hold the phone to the head. And that's the exposure that is used even for certification. So there is that large uncertainty that also plays into what the maximum measured SAR should be in order to ensure that most of the phones actually are under the regulatory SAR. If you have a huge uncertainty in your measurements, then you have to stay underneath. And Lloyd's brought that up before. There are weaknesses in the refinement and verification and validation of the dielectric parameters, including the range of dielectric parameters, because not everybody's brain materials are the same. And although in a lot of the studies, you'll see them refer to dielectric constants, but they're not constants. They vary according to age, they vary according to frequency, and they vary individually. So we have to recognize this within our modeling. There's refinement of modeling at the micro scale. Right now, although we break the brain up into certain components, certain parts of the brain, the frontal lobe and so on, and nevertheless within that compartment, be it for instance the frontal lobe, that is still considered to be homogeneous. But there are ways to model at the cellular level. So somehow we need to bring that sort of tissue level, microcellular level modeling and take it up to the level where you would be modeling muscles and modeling parts of the brain and so on. So there's kind of gap. We still have not gone all the way from SAM to a truly, truly realistic head yet. We're on our way. So our second question was, are current models of tissue dosimetry applicable to these new technologies? And the approaches continue to be valid, but we do need to have improvements due to the frequency changes and what they call transfer factors. This is kind of interpretation of modeling on different scales. We don't have good skin models, and we talked about that the other day with regard to the sweat ducts. Standing waves are very important in an intermediate range, which is a little bit below radio frequency. The eyes, the ears, the hand, these are all still, in progress. And again, these dielectric properties, which is fundamental to the modeling, at higher frequencies are really not well known.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Was there an implicit criticism of the current modeling, and did you specifically talk about treating the ear like the foot, and what would be, I guess the question I have is, how do we get to something better from what we have right now? Because if we say it's going to take forever, it's going to take a long time to do what you have here.
Actually, what we recognize within the modeling group, within this group, is that there are actually two different types of issues. And these two issues tend to get kind of mixed up together because the manufacturers and the regulators need to have a test that can be done that's recognized as being relevant and is doable, because every time you want to, register a watch to put on the market, or, a smartwatch or a new device, you can't do a big research project. So we have to identify something that is relevant, and we agreed that SAM was not really relevant. So
But what Ezra told us yesterday?
yeah.
When we sat yesterday evening, Ezra explained to Meg and me that the SAR doesn't really differentiate between different tissues. Like for the SAR,
No, we know
just
that.
heating per.
And we'll get to that later.
She'll be talking
Yeah.
about that, but just as an answer to Deborah's question, and he did suggest something else that already exists. She will present it.
Okay.
It was
Yeah.
something
Mhm.
43 something. Okay.
Yes. The group agreed that for compliance purposes, that the SAM-SAR was only dealt with athermal issues, and what is more important.
Even for thermal effects,
Mhm.
one
Wait,
value.
give him the microphone, please.
Yeah.
Where is it? I don't know what happened to it.
There's one here. I'm tied down. Hang on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Now, what we was saying is even for thermal effects, the same SAR level can cause different heatings and different effects in different tissues. It's not the same thing to have 1 degree or a certain heating level in one tissue than in another. A high SAR in a low vasculated tissue, like in the inside the eye, is different than a high SAR perhaps in the skin. We don't know what a certain value of SAR means for one tissue or for another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. So our next question is, what's the status of tissue dosimetry modeling in susceptible groups and organs? For example, the child or the fetus or the testes. So what we have today, we have an increasing number of child frequency, FDTD, frequency domain time. Frequency difference time domain, yes. Autonomical models also for the fetus, the child, and the adolescents, and recognition of the vulnerability of the adolescents as the brain finishes maturation is something which it's been kind of slipping under the radar a bit. Adolescents are very difficult for many reasons, but anyway, we need better pregnant and fetus models, and there's some data on tissue sensitivity, but that's another gap. An alternative thermal pathway approach would be the CEM43, where they look at the sensitivity of a whole bunch of different kinds of tissues to a certain increase in the temperature. And this is something which has been verified at lower frequencies, but has not been applied at this kind of frequency. So this is getting very. This is. Mm-hmm.
Ezra explained that they take a tissue and then they see how many minutes it takes. They differentiate for each tissue how many minutes it takes to heat beyond 43 degrees, something like that. So
No, actually,
or
what they do is they identify the amount of tissue damage at 43 degrees, and then they see at what temperature over what time.
It was a matter of minutes. It was. He said for some the same thing they did would be 5 minutes for one tissue and 2 hours for a different tissue. I can't really explain.
Yeah,
it was too complex. But that would be a way to differentiate effects between different tissues, which he suggests would be better than SAR. But it's heat. It's still heat.
It's still
only
heat,
thermal.
yes.
But it still differentiates better between tissues than the SAR method.
Yes, well, he was suggesting that type of approach of, he wasn't suggesting that that approach should be replicated, but that it's possible to identify an effect in a tissue given a certain period of time with a certain exposure, and then using different exposures, you can look at the relative sensitivity of these various tissues.
This is done in vivo?
No,
No,
it's done in vitro, and it does not take into account perfusion. Well, some of it was, but okay.
This is done in silico. This is done in a model, a computer model, with the Maxwell equation, with electron. This is done in the computer models. When the electromagnetics
It's
equations
validated in
are
vitro.
modeled and running, simulated, and the thermodynamics equations and fluid equations also are modeled. Then the electromagnetic field, the SIR, which is the result of the electromagnetic simulation, is an input for the thermic simulations.
And this was
that is,
actually,
you know,
yeah,
If I may. So basically, if you remember some of those very fancy, impressive, beautiful pictures he was making, those are all models, okay? But they're four-dimensional. You've got, you know, space, time, depth, and then you can move them in time and space. But frankly, they're models.
yes.
Okay, so the model is only good as what you put into it, and it's called in silico, and ITIS has now invested a lot of money in getting those models accepted, but they're not real people. They're not.
Actually,
yes.
There is a little bit more to this story.
Okay.
This is all done in the context of MRI, and the values that you put into the computer models were validated using tissues from various types of animals. And so there has been validation of these parameters, but just in vitro. Okay? So the short form is that there is a precedent in terms of an approach. You couldn't simply replicate the experiments, but there is an approach. So, anybody want a doctoral thesis? It's not going to happen tomorrow. And we obviously, there was no doubt within the group that simply measuring energy deposition was not sufficient, that we had to look at signal characteristics, at peak doses, and so on. And there was no argument about that. We did not spend a lot of time talking about that. So dosimetry, we have to be doing dosimetry on other metrics. And there are, under development, other phantoms for various children from multiple ages, pregnancies and testes, including, and we do need, as I said, clarification regarding dielectric parameters and their ranges. This is a rather short question. We were asked to look at assessing tissue dosimetry from texting or using headsets, basically having the device close to you but at some distance from your body. There's no major research gap there. We know that texting uses lower power than speech. Claudio indicated that any modeling of this would be quite straightforward and could be done within a short period of time if we had, specific modeling that we wanted to do. And Esra indicated that headsets have been studied quite extensively, and we know that they can reduce exposure, but Bluetooth is not the answer to all of our prayers. Sorry? Yes?
In today's smartphone, most of the time the person gets radiation is when it's in its pocket, either if it's the shirt pocket or pants pocket. So maybe not just hand-free and different locations on the body than just the heel. Okay.
Yes, that's separate. So we were asked to look at policy opportunities. And actually, policy kind of got divided into two, because there's policy opportunities and then there's other translation of our recommendations into policies. So we've kind of got two policy sections, which is a bit messy, so I apologize for that. We have to investigate risks prior to new technologies being introduced. And we've got an opportunity right now, this is what we're focusing on here, because 5G standards are under development. And the other big issue that was identified was wireless power transfer. So this wireless charging of batteries, everything from your cell phone to your car can wirelessly be charged using, there's a variety of different technologies there. So we won't get into that, but that's a major opportunity right now to figure out how that's done, what are the possible exposures, and how can those be minimized. The policy, there are opportunities with the emerging information and frankly with the results of this forum. There are opportunities to test fields and radiation under conditions with all the devices operating, with measurements made by experts using high quality equipment, testing the EIR power, which is the power, if what often gets tested is the generalized power, but there's a lot of directionality, so the power should be tested in the direction at which it's pointed from these directional antennae. We also have to be testing electric and magnetic fields, and just testing root mean square power averaged over a period of time is not particularly relevant. It's, of interest, but and a specific focus should be made on schools. We're asked about these real-world exposure situations and multiple antennae and how dosimetry or exposure would be estimated under these kinds of circumstances. If you are estimating exposure from multiple sources, you can, to a certain extent, add exposures if you are interested in thermal pathways. But cumulative summation over time is not really, it's not nearly as relevant if what you're interested in are quantities like the peak and the modulation. Again, we should be reporting the equivalent isotropically radiated power. That's in whatever direction the power is focused. We should characterize the exposure and the devices in realistic networks. There are certain dosimeters that can be used. They have strengths and weaknesses. There are. We did discuss. I thought that perhaps you didn't want to go into all of those details right now. Personal dosimeters, they will measure the. You can perhaps put them on your arm. They've been used in places like schools where it captures the absorption at various frequencies. So you have an idea that you can download afterwards. It's blinded. So it has been done that, for instance, somebody who is reporting that they are electrically hypersensitive, they can wear this device on their arm. It's not radiating. And then they can keep a little diary. At 1 o'clock, I suddenly felt awful. I felt weak. I got a headache at 2, and I felt fine at 6, this kind of thing. And then you can download the data, and you can correlate, recognizing that EHS symptoms may have a delay, but you can nevertheless attempt to correlate the exposures that had been measured during the day with what was kept in the diary. And this can be done over a period of time. There are also, there can also be characterization of spaces. So for instance, Hardell has done some characterization of train stations. You can characterize inside buses, inside trains, inside schoolrooms. And again, you have to be careful to specify exactly how, under what conditions these are. Are you going to do it at rush hour? Are you going to do it at 1 o'clock in the morning when there's hardly anybody there? Are you going to do it when everything is powered up and the kids are all streaming movies or uploading their video projects? Nevertheless, our recommendation was that any measurements you should attempt to do them when exposures would be highest, because that would be the most precautionary approach.
Just a point on the Hardell study. 98 to 99% of the radiation came from downlinks, not uplinks. Uplinks is when you're transmitting, downlinks. And so all over this train station, 98 to 99% of the radiation being absorbed was from the downlinks. When, in my opinion, there should have been nothing should have been close to the power he's reporting.
What do you mean?
it was very high from what is necessary. And it's like they're placed in locations that are so, like he has a picture of somebody with their head just a teeny little ways away from this thing, because they're just, no one's thinking about the placement. They just, it's general workers going around bump, 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 bump with these local transmittings.
So perhaps
And
Wi-Fi.
the meter he used is, though expensive, it looks at 20 different things. It looks at it in time with a GPS, and it's really a sophisticated machine.
Yes, the equipment needed to do this in a sophisticated and very useful way can be very, very expensive.
About 6,000.
Yeah, well, you probably got a good deal then. Yeah, you can spend a lot more than that. Then our last question, which is, don't feel that you're almost done yet, because this is a biggie. What are major data gaps, research needs, research priorities, and opportunities? And we did talk about opportunities earlier, so there was a bit of an overlap there. Nevertheless, we need mechanism research, and this is where it's really nice to be in this room today, because yesterday and the day before I was thinking, we all need to be in the same room together, because we need to be, combining the biomarkers that are seen for EHS with the potential biomarkers and so on. So it would really be nice to have something much better than these very generalized kind of biomarkers for exposure. I'm sure that we're going to end up with sort of a constellation of biomarkers for individuals who are suffering from EHS. That's what's happened with MCS, and there's a lot of overlap there. Nevertheless, at the end, you'll see we've started a table, and you will get it in your email, and we really welcome people differentiating between mechanisms and biomarkers and adding to our list. And we hope that since eventually we want to be measuring something other than SAR, we would like to cross-tabulate somehow what certain kinds of characteristics of the signal may possibly correlate with certain mechanisms. So this is a big research need. Well, for instance, membranes can be very, very sensitive to the rate of change of an electric field. Now, I've never seen people really refer to the rate of change of an electric field when they are doing radio frequency radiation exposure of sperm, for instance. So, and possibly researchers could go back and report on that, and that may be low-hanging fruit in terms of adding another dimension to existing research and seeing how that looks. But that's just one example. So anything related to a membrane, perhaps it's related to the rate of change of the electric field. Yeah. Or maybe it's the second derivative. It could be how quickly it goes over the hump. So we are in the process of attempting to identify quantities of interest, and then moving forward with research to say, okay, what might be a better measure than SAR? Okay. In terms of measurements, we said we want to identify real-world measurements in schools and transportations, occupational exposures, and this is going to require some evolution of measurement technology to measure sensitively enough. We've got some very expensive equipment around. Pardon? But this is something where we will need some development of equipment.
And this is where Ellie Levine's ideas come in?
Actually, Ellie was talking about methods of using current equipment to measure what was in schools. So Ellie was...
differently in terms of antennas, right? He wanted to measure the
It was-
exposed to, right?
It was Ellie who was saying that we should be measuring the focused exposure rather than the general exposure. That's, so some of the things that I've already said came from Ellie. And in terms of dosimetry for the future technologies, we need to, we have a little bit of a list of some of these possible topics. And right now we need to have the dielectric parameters. There's a lot of research that we still need in order to properly do dosimetry for 5G because we don't have these models yet. And these are simply other parameters that we should be looking at, including Li-Fi. That's another, that will be an interesting application that will go through walls even worse than 5G. Exactly. Yes, I know. 5G is not very good at going through walls, and Li-Fi definitely won't. I was being...
There's Li-Fi and the truth-fi.
Oh, well, we'll concentrate on that. We'll see if we can get the truth-fi outside of these walls. There's a good... Okay. In terms of vulnerable populations, obviously we know about those kinds of things, and we need to know more about the mechanisms of action, the development, what can happen during myelination, particularly as the frequencies change, other vulnerabilities, or the thyroid or the bone composition. And we also have to look at co-exposures. The Korean study that Deborah presented the other day is a very powerful demonstration that the radiofrequency radiation plus a known brain toxicant can act synergistically. We've seen this in more than 100 cell studies. This is a very serious thing, and it should be something we should be considering going forward. We might want to make some kind of recommendation in general toxicology that radiofrequency radiation must be considered in all toxicology, particularly in today's world. We also have to be cognizant of people who are going to be more sensitive than others due to medical interventions. Some drugs apparently can predispose people to greater sensitivities to radiofrequency radiation. And we have to also be aware of things like metal implants and braces and glasses and so on, because they can change fields. And you can get induced currents. And again, we want to look at these exposures and biomarkers within the research context. And also within research context, I added this is not from the group, but from discussions this morning. And in epidemiology, sometimes you sort of have to seize the opportunity. And as technologies change, and they change in one country before they change in another country, we are actually carrying out natural experiments. And it would be, it's sort of opportune to try to take advantage of these. For instance, the children in Haifa, most of them don't have Wi-Fi in schools, whereas other places they do. So is it possible to look at the children who are within these two types of environments, who otherwise have similar food and so on? So anyway, it's just throwing it out there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Claudia was mentioning that in Uruguay, they've had this one laptop per child policy, whereas in Brazil, they require all school construction to accommodate wired connections. So, you know, that was just one example, and I don't know enough about air pollution, and I expect you probably make a really good point. But nevertheless, I think we should just be aware that there are probably opportunities for that are going to be passing, you know. And then we were asked, we separated this into policy translation. So obviously, for children, we would highly recommend reducing or eliminating exposures, and because of children's characteristics, and there should be policy specific for children. We need guidelines for education, and an interesting thought of Yael's was that there could be kind of a challenge to industry to develop something that's much, much safer. For instance, in Israel, because of security concerns, you want your children to be able to call home if necessary, but you don't really want them to be walking around with something that would successfully land you on the moon, and they don't need to have to put it to their ear. No, like there's enough capability in a phone to, like there's more capability in one of those things that you can put in your pocket than what they use to land the guys on the moon. It's just it really is magical, I tell you. Okay, we also have to identify means to accommodate people with environmental sensitivities. And we need that new schools, as in Brazil, be built and prepared to receive wired connections. We also think that generally we need better education and dialogue with and involvement of concerned citizens with transparent and required responses from authorities. You know, it's very, very difficult for concerned parents if they say something and then everybody vanishes from the room and they come back with some declaration. It's much better to be part of the conversation. And since we are in such a complex world now, and it's getting increasingly complex, we need to really look seriously at policies, guidelines, and standards for multi-source and multi-frequency, multi-directional, whatever, for these very complex exposures. This is tough because I don't think that there's any two the same. And we need to have public spaces assessments, and that should be available. You know, we have air pollution monitoring, and you can look on the internet and find out how polluted it is in New York today, or in downtown Toronto. So one day, perhaps, we will have some kind of indication, which wouldn't have to be on a daily basis, of what these exposures are. And this is, you probably won't be able to read that very well. This is just our beginning of our table where we're looking at the mechanisms or pathways. We just started to try to look at the mapping them, and then we looked at these quantities, which would be SAR or average SAR, incident power density, peak in vivo electric fields, modulation amplitudes, pulse shapes, inhomogeneity measures, and there are mathematical ways of looking at that within tissues. In vivo current density, with or without averaging, increases in temperature, activating functions, and so on. So that's what all of the brainstorming that happened down at the end of the hall. And I really have to thank everybody. They